We're going to keep going with Nestor now, and I was thinking about something I don't think we've talked about, and that is the epiphany, which is sort of Joyce's MO. If you don't know the term, it can be used in religious context. It can be used in scientific context, in literature, as Joyce uses it, it's just this sudden realization of something that you had maybe been aware of before, but suddenly you see it in an entirely new light. You can think of it as a paradigm shift. I think of it as similar to when you learn something that you've been exposed to a lot, like an idea in studying math or studying music or studying whatever, and all of a sudden something that's been really confusing and difficult all of a sudden just snaps into place and you understand it. That's really what Joyce is doing throughout his books. Yeah, you can go back as far back as Dubliners. Even in those stories, there are things where a character will suddenly realize something that see the world in an entirely new way. I think of in The Dead, when Gabriel is in the house and he's looking up and he sees, I can't remember the exact line, but Joyce is saying something like, what is the significance of a woman standing in a doorway at the top of a staircase, or something like that. And he really is imparting to you that feeling of, what does this mean? What is this situation in the context of my life? I think that is something over and over. And if you find yourself being bored by Joyce, my guess is you're reading way too fast. Just slow down and start to see what he's juxtaposing from sentence to sentence within each sentence, because he really has a lot to say. This is what makes it such a rereadable book. Now, what about this letter of Mr. Deasy's that he gives Stephen to get published in the newspaper? What is that about? Why is Joyce including this? I think there's a few reasons. One, it gives Stephen an opportunity to go to the newspaper and have that chapter, and it's also where Leopold Bloom, the other major character, works. So it's going to give them a chance to almost cross paths. But also, I think it really is a good contrast between Stephen, who's constantly in these really ethereal, up in the air, just poetic thoughts that are totally divorced from the everyday world, and Mr. Deasy, who's down to earth. He's very interested in money and, this topic of cattle and foot and mouth disease. It's so mundane. You cannot imagine anything more down to earth, right? So I think it's just a good contrast. But also, if you look at how Stephen reads the letter, he doesn't even read it. He just kind of skims it and just jumps from cliche to cliche. And I think that's to show that he doesn't really care what's in it, and that he is not able to find anything of interest in it or in Mr. Deasy. It also shows a different point of view in how the world works, in that Mr. Deasy, just by knowing people, knowing Stephen, I think it's his brother or some friend or something that has this information about foot and mouth disease, he hopes to influence the government. And at first it might seem kind of nutty, but then you think about it, and a lot of actually governments and organizations and corporations work just like this. People know each other, and they may not be the best placed people to act on things, but that's how it happens. This letter is also a parallel that we're going to see. There's a lot of parallels between Stephen and Bloom, in that they both deal with a letter. Bloom is going to get a letter from his daughter, and we'll look at it later. But just notice for now how Stephen reads this letter, and compare it later on to how Bloom reads the letter from his daughter. I notice in the scene with the classroom and the kids, there's this sentence I liked. It's mirthless, high, malicious laughter. And that brought immediately to mind, for me, a portrait of the artist as a young man. And that I think what Joyce is doing in this chapter and the next is showing the development that Stephen has had, his childhood at these private schools, these strict learnings, and how it ultimately leads him into this really abstract place. And from there, he doesn't really have a direction to go in, and I think that's why Joyce shifts the focus to Bloom and shows how not necessarily being totally grounded in the world like Mr. Deasy, but having some mixture of the artist and the practical is maybe something that Stephen can look into. We start to see Stephen touching a lot on Aristotle too in this chapter, and I think that's something that the reason Joyce admired Aristotle, as near as I can tell, is that Aristotle, unlike Plato, who was very interested in these very lofty ideas, Aristotle was also interested in that, but he was also very interested in the natural world. He wrote books on zoology and very practical things, as well as philosophy. And that is, I think, what I see in Joyce, this very broad, omnivorous hunger for different types of knowledge. Now, in the class, when the kids ask Stephen to tell them a story or give them a riddle, what is that about? Why is Joyce including that? He tells this strange riddle that doesn't even have a question in it. And it's very confusing, I think, for the kids. Why is Joyce doing this? This is really one of the typical riddles or puzzles that you're going to find in Ulysses. There are several others, or quite a few others. But this one is, there's no easy answer to it. There are ideas, and you can Google plenty of ideas, but I think two clear things that come to mind for me is somehow this is connected with Jesus. Either Jesus is telling the riddle or it's about Jesus. The frame of it, though, there's no question. Normally when you give a kid a riddle, you say, why is this, or what is happening here? Stephen doesn't even do that. He just tells them this poem and they're confused and they have no idea what's going on. I think that is sort of a microcosm for the entire book. Joyce is presenting us this story or this riddle, and he doesn't even say what the question is or what is it that we're supposed to be looking for. I think that's my view of it, that the kids are somehow the audience. Most of the readers of Ulysses are going to be confused and not have any idea what is going on. So I think that's how Joyce is framing it. There seems to be some connection with Jesus, the cock crew. Think of Peter denying Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. I think that's how it goes. Anyways, that comes up in Time for This Soul to Go to Heaven. You can also see that. But also this thing about the fox. Apparently foxes dig up dead creatures. I didn't know this. You might want to look more into it, but that's somehow connected to it. So think of Stephen, whose recently dead mother. He is, throughout this book, in a sense, metaphorically, digging up her, bringing her to light in his head. And also think of this, throughout the book, you're going to see animal references of various nature. Stephen is sometimes connected to dogs. He will refer to himself as dog's body, dog body. And this dream about the panther, some people say that the panther is Bloom, Leopold Bloom, who throughout the book is stalking Stephen or following him in different ways. In some ways, though, I think that Stephen is more the panther himself. I'm not going to get too into it, but you can think about it in different ways, but just know it's there. A further thing with the riddle is this connection with fate and destiny, which is something you see throughout Joyce. And there's this great line after he delivers the riddle to the class. This is what Joyce writes. He stood up and gave a shout of nervous laughter, to which their cries echoed dismay. And I think that's typical of Joyce. He's presenting this story to us, and most of us are not going to understand it. It's just over our heads. We're not going to bother with it. But Joyce, as he tells it, he is just so caught up in it that he laughs. I said we're going to be seeing more and more of Stephen's consciousness. That consciousness is going to be going to 2 places, essentially. The past. A lot of this he'll be recounting in this chapter and the next. His time in Paris, that trip, what that led to. There's all these brief allusions that we can puzzle out. And then also the future and his imagination, basically. So the past is memory, and the future and any imagination imaginings that go on are taking place, but they're really all the same place in his mind, his consciousness, and we're going to see that more and more. As you read all these digressions, and if you feel yourself getting lost, just jump to the next paragraph. Most of them are not too essential. You're not going to be confused later on. Just keep going with it and jump to the next part that someone's talking or something actual in the real world is happening. You don't need to get stuck on these little points at this time in reading the book. This is your first reading probably, so just keep going with it. When Stephen enters Mr. Deasy's study, there's an immediate feel of money and coins. That's really what Joyce is evoking in this chapter. Stephen remembers the first time that he was there, and every time that he's talked to him, really, they've discussed money or he's gotten his salary. It seems to be his third time getting his salary, or 3 times before. I'm not clear if it's 3 months or every other week. I don't know how often he gets paid, but really this guy is just somebody that he has this monetary transaction with. There's this great irony too, that the thing that Deasy says that an Englishman is best known for is this quote, and that's, "I paid my way." And the irony of it is that the British Empire, of course, is built on the backs of all these other people that it oppressed to raise itself up in the world. So yes, they worked within their system, but people like Mr. Deasy are born into a certain position, and it's built on the backs of others. But Stephen is not above money either. He has all these debts that he thinks of, and they include Buck Mulligan. So keep that in mind. If you think that Mulligan is leeching off Stephen by saying, "Oh, we gotta spend your money on drinking," Mulligan, according to Stephen's memory, he owes £9 to Mulligan's, which is not an insignificant amount. So just keep that in mind, that he's allowing him to stay at his house, and he's probably trying to get some of that money back in the form of drinking. When Deasy says, "You think that I'm an old Tory," he's talking about the political party in England at the time, the Conservative Party, and referring to Stephen as a Fenian, which Stephen certainly is not, but it's really a way of dividing them into these real extremes, which neither of them probably are to that extent. A Fenian is the Irish political group that was trying to assert itself and gain more independence. Stephen thinks of Cranley. I think, if I remember correctly, Cranley was a character in A Portrait of the Artist, but really all you need to know is that he was somebody that, a good friend of Stephen, and from this paragraph in this chapter, we get a flashback of Stephen and Cranley going to the races to gamble on horses. One other thing about Deasy's letter is that it will allow him to transition into talking about the German Jews having control of England, and he'll make this comment that the Jews sinned against the light, that is, they killed Jesus or led to Jesus being killed. And Stephen's reply is that who has not sinned against the light? And Deasy is just incapable of understanding that concept. I think, from Stephen's point of view as this hardcore Platonist, or view that God descends into man and inhabits all of man. And I'll quote that point later on, I think in Proteus, when Deasy is just incapable of seeing that. He just doesn't understand that concept. He thinks the Jews killed Jesus, end of story. This really is a very different perspective from Stephen. There's a lot of great quotes in this chapter from Stephen that would easily fit into the notebook that Haynes was talking about publishing, with all these witty sayings, but probably the most famous line in the entire book: "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." And it's a good quote. You can think about it. But I think it really connects to Stephen's idea of Platonism and emerging into this mortal form of sin and confusion and ignorance, and that really only by escaping the prejudices and confusion and hatred of history can we escape into true understanding. I don't think that Stephen or Joyce is saying that we should forget history by any means. He's saying that we should overcome it and move beyond our petty past and that Joyce clearly knows a great deal about history, and he'll include it in Ulysses. So it's clear that he's not saying in any type of 1984 way we should suppress and forget history. That's not what he's saying. As a ridiculous character, I think Deasy is kind of fascinating, and there's this great line at the end after he's been railing against women too. He goes, or Joyce says, "A cough ball of laughter leaped from his throat, dragging after it a rattling chain of phlegm." This is a fun chapter. I enjoyed it a little more, I think, than Telemachus, which felt like the overture of a symphony in which not too much happened, but you can get hints of things that are going to be happening in the book throughout the day. This chapter, things are starting to take place. There's a little conflict, actually, you can see between Stephen's perspective and Deasy, but really this is the end of Deasy in the book. So if you loved him, sorry, he's gone. But you can always come back and revisit this chapter as you like it. I'm going to move on now to the next chapter, which is Proteus.